This is the Soyuz. It is not only the most reliable space taxi of the modern era, but it is currently the only space taxi of the modern era. With such a reputation, one might imagine the craft's upbringing would have entailed the flawless combination of years' worth of rocketry experience, cheerfully shared and discussed by the world's greatest engineers in an effort to create the perfect craft. But this could not be further from the truth. In fact, when the Soyuz was conceived, the space race had only just begun, and the actual development of the early craft was by no means cheerful.
The Soyuz program in its earliest days was, to put it mildly, Russian. The craft was conceived in 1960, and the first manned flight, Soyuz 1, was required to launch within the year of the Communist Revolution's 50th anniversary, 7 years later. Prototypes had only begun launching in 1966, leaving Soyuz engineers with 1 year to iron out technical problems. At last, in the days before launch, they still had more than 200 problems to fix, and no time to fix them.
On April 23, 1967, Soyuz 1 carried Vladimir Komarov into space, marking the first manned mission for the Soyuz spacecraft. Orbital insertion was successful, but once the capsule and its pilot were alone in the vacuum of space, the malfunctions began. First, one of the capsule's 2 solar panel arrays failed to deploy. With only half the power input it was built for, the craft struggled to sustain its more intensive systems, namely those of heating, navigation, and communication. Komarov's life was hanging by 1 solar panel and a few rechargeable batteries. With this, orientation systems began to malfunction, and even as the rest of the mission was aborted, orienting the craft as needed for its engines to return it from orbit proved a challenge. The ground crew desperately attempted to help Komarov return from orbit, and 24 hours after launch, they were successful.
Soyuz 1 did return Komarov to Earth from orbit, but it did so by slamming the man into the ground at orbital speeds. The reentry module's parachutes had failed to deploy, their housings damaged by the pressure difference between the inside of the Soyuz and the vacuum of space. This issue, oddly enough, was not even included in the 200-plus design flaws identified before launch, since engineers had not had the time to test the craft so thoroughly. Ultimately, completing the monumental task of docking 2 spacecraft was more important to Soviet leadership than ensuring the safety and integrity of said mission.
Today, such ignorance will never be tolerated, as Carl Whittenburg of the Jet Propulsion Laboratory assured us.
In my career, I haven't had an experience where there was no delay tolerated. The closest I could say was in this latest mission, Parker Solar Probe, we launched in August. There was pressure, of course, to make the launch window, but I think also it was sound engineering judgment. So I don't think we proceeded with any undue risk, but there was a lot of discussion about it. Should we delay and do additional testing, or can we convince ourselves that we have tested thoroughly and meet the window? And that's probably the closest that I've seen in my career.
On October 30th of 1967, Cosmos 186 and 188, 2 unmanned Soyuz capsules, partially docked on the opposite side of the world from Russia, marking the first time in history that 2 spacecrafts had docked in orbit. Bonus points because the docking had to be completely robotic, since the position of the crafts had prevented them from communicating with Russia. Although excessive rapid movement prevented them from properly docking, Russia was still proudly a step ahead of the US. This mission was also a crucial step in getting the Soyuz program back on its feet.
In June of 1971, Soyuz 11 carried 3 cosmonauts into space, but depressurized during re-entry above the Kármán line, marking the first and only deaths to this date, which occurred in space. Consequently, in July of the next year, Cosmos 496 only sported 2 seats, both empty, and the third was replaced with backup life support systems. This mission launched and landed successfully, replacing the Soyuz 7K OK with the Soyuz 7K T. The Soyuz had taken a step in a new direction, not to be slower, but certainly more steady.
The actual mission of Soyuz 18A was a fiery failure, but far from tragedy. What would have been a routine trip to the Salyut station ended in an abort mid-launch when faulty pyrotechnic charges failed to separate the first stage from the second. Eventually, the second stage engine managed to destroy the remaining connections to the lower stage, allowing the upper stages to escape, but this ordeal had set the craft off course. Onboard gyroscopes detected the deviation and triggered the abort, allowing the crew to escape safely in their Soyuz capsule. This impressive display of explosive acrobatics clearly demonstrated that the Soyuz capsule itself was not only capable of performing reliably, but capable of performing impressively in unforeseen circumstances. Bear in mind, it was the Soyuz's launch escape system which allowed the crew of this mission to escape with their lives.
In September of 1983, the Soyuz would once again demonstrate its increasingly remarkable ability to escape the jaws of death. Soyuz T-10A was on the launch pad when a valve fueling the A tube beneath it failed to close properly, drenching the launch pad in volatile rocket fuel, which promptly caught fire. The fire quickly spread and burned through the systems, which would have triggered an automatic abort, and with no manual abort available to the cosmonauts, this left only the ground crew to trigger the abort. This required 2 technicians in buildings more than 20 miles from the launch pad to press a button within 5 seconds of each other, after receiving a code word from both the rocket's technical manager and another official. Despite these convoluted anti-sabotage measures, the Soyuz T-10A capsule was ejected and flew its cosmonauts to safety mere seconds before the A2 detonated.
The tragic losses of Soyuz 1 and Soyuz 11 demonstrated the shortcomings inherent of a program fueled by political pressure and unrealistic deadlines. Russia's early desire to outperform the United States in the space race clearly got to the head of their leadership, ultimately resulting in the deaths of Komarov and the Soyuz 11 crew.
However, as time passed and the Soyuz design had a chance to be tested and perfected, the triumphs of Soyuz 18A and T-10A demonstrated the remarkable abilities of a well-developed capsule to keep its crew alive and to do its job as well as possible.
If that wasn't enough to convince you, an interesting juxtaposition can be made between the Soyuz program and the various endeavors of NASA over the years. While Russia had Soyuz, the Americans had the Mercury program for manned orbital flight, the Gemini program for practicing space rendezvous and extravehicular activities, the Apollo program for lunar exploration, and Skylab as a space station, all within 1959 to 1974.
The juxtaposition being that Soyuz had this entire period, and then some, during which it had the full attention of Russia's rocket scientists. Meanwhile, NASA was dividing their attention between several different programs, none of which survived more than 15 years, ultimately ensuring that the crafts involved would never reach perfection like the Soyuz has. Our takeaway?
Time is good. The more time you put into a project, the better the outcome will be.